So, Atraxa, you love her or you hate her? Either way, my friends are doing a challenge to put a new spin on this iconic 4/4 Flying Vigilance Death Touch Lifelink Phyrexian Angel horror. As your resident obscure card and list enthusiast, I've put together something despicable. Stick around if you enjoy Magic trivia. The thing about Atraxa is she's been the #1 commander on EDH Rec for quite a while now, which means an overwhelming amount of players have already built her. And so the premise of this challenge was to take the most overdone commander and rework it in the most unique way possible. Looking at our choices, the most popular ways to build Atraxa are Infect, Planeswalkers or Super Friends, Phyrexian Typal, or +1/+1 counters. No doubt we've seen all these, so what else can you do with Atraxa's effects? She has an effective body, so what about Voltron? We could build her on angel typing, since many angels give +1/+1 counters, or maybe a deck that uses Proliferate to make more energy, or progress the chapters on your sagas, maybe an experience counter deck. Some of these deck ideas are cool, but they don't make me feel interested in Atraxa herself. After all, the challenge is to build the most unique deck, and many of these work super well outside of Atraxa. So back to the drawing board. My first idea was to build a deck that leverages Atraxa's greatest strength, her ability to be universally hated and eat removal spells. So I wanted to build a deck that cares when Atraxa is in the graveyard. Unfortunately, there aren't enough cards to make this idea work yet, thus we have to resort to my second idea. In my previous video, I talked about all the unique mechanics in Magic, from discarding as a special action to circling color symbols on a card pre-game. In that video, we went over cards like Divine Intervention, Midnight Clock, and Rasputin Dreamweaver. Each of these cards uses counters in unique ways, with rules that only apply to that one card. Two of these didn't make it into the final deck, but as your resident Scryfall trivia wizard, I feel like it's my duty to let everyone know about even more obscure card effects. And if the name of the game is uniqueness, what better way than unique counters? In Magic, there are currently just over 100 cards legal in Atraxa EDH decks that reference a counter not seen on other cards. Unsurprisingly, most of them are unplayable trash like Voodoo Doll, Fasting, or Frankenstein's Monster. But from the depths of the garbage pile, we did salvage quite a few cards that work in an Atraxa deck. And so the gimmick for this deck: 1. Use as many cards that reference unique counters as possible. 2. Use as many different counters as possible. And 3. Still have a shred of playability. Can we do it? Stick around and find out. Before we begin, I'm a new content creator and I make videos about Magic trivia and design. If you could help me out by hitting that like button and subscribing to my channel, it would mean a lot. I also have a Patreon if you would like to support me directly. The core of every deck is ramp and card draw. Atraxa costs 4 different types of mana, so it's important that we have ample ways to produce it. Prize Pig and Twitching Doll are 2 mana dorks that make rainbow mana, but also reference unique counters. Prize Pig uses ribbon counters that let it untap when it gets 3. And Twitching Doll puts nest counters on itself that can be later converted into spiders. Component Pouch and Replicating Ring use component and night counters respectively. Atraxa can proliferate these and get us a bunch of mana. Like I mentioned in the intro, Midnight Clock made it into a ramp package because it's one of only 2 cards that use our counters, and the only one to invoke Rule 122.7. Watch this video. But even I couldn't justify running Rasputin Dreamweaver, who used to be the only source of dream counters. Luckily, they did rework him recently, and at the very least, this one can be construed as playable. He enters with dream counters that can be removed to add colorless mana, but in the late game can produce an unlimited amount of 2/2 pro-red night tokens with Atraxa's Proliferate effect. We round out this package with Armored Scrapgorger and Biophagus, 2 more mana dorks that produce oil and +1/+1 counters, and finally some staple cards for Atraxa. Astral Cornucopia, Everflowing Chalice, and Gyrosage produce more and more mana once we proliferate their counters. Pretty self-explanatory. Looking back, Sol Ring is the only card in this list that doesn't synergize with Commander at all. What do you think? Should I cut this? Moving on to our card draw package, we were blessed with a bunch of good options. The One Ring needs no introduction, but I should remind you that it is the only card that produces bird encounters. Palantir of Orthanc, Dawn of a New Age, and Investigator's Journal are the only cards that produce Influence, Hope, and Suspect counters respectively. Tome of Legends is one of only 6 cards that use page counters. Each of these more or less translates into an extra card per turn. Fathom Mage, Polywog Prodigy, Danny Pink, and Generous Patron all produce +1/+1 counters, but can also draw us a really decent amount of cards. Danny Pink in particular is really cool in any deck with Proliferate. For each creature you control, the first counter you put on it per turn nets you a card. This card is perfect in Atraxa, and I think it's criminally underplayed. Let's talk about Mystic Remora. Does it fit the spirit of the deck? We all know it as an enchantment that draws us cards when our opponents play non-creature spells, but the reason why I included it was because cumulative upkeep is tracked using age counters. These interact negatively with Atraxa's effect because the more age counters there are, the more mana you have to pay to keep it alive. One of my worst ideas for this deck was to only include counters that are detrimental to Proliferate, but I figured the theme was already a huge disadvantage. That's why our ramp package doesn't include Devoted Druid or Eryximethys, even though Eryximethys is the only card that makes slumber counters. What do you think? With ramp and card draw out of the way, let's talk about our primary Wincons and synergies. First, we have Boon of the Spirit Realm, which is the only card that makes blessing counters. It adds 1 whenever it or another enchantment enters. Each blessing counter buffs our team by +1/+1, so they're great to proliferate. Simic Ascendancy is one of 6 cards that produce growth counters, and can help us win the game once we've placed 20 +1/+1 counters. We have a few cards that can produce 1 of +1/+1 counters, but this works well with Felidar Retreat, Quilled Greatworm, and Zimone Paradox Sculptor. These cards add a ton of counters, allowing Atraxa's effect to rack up growth counters fast. Luminarch Ascension is a card that can win games on its own by producing an unlimited amount of 4/4 angels. It's one of few quest counter cards, and triggers if you reach any opponent's end step without losing life. Atraxa is a great blocker, and she can proliferate the quest counters if need be. Hoofprint of the Stag and Ominous Seas are the only 2 cards that make Hoofprint and Foreshadow counters. They both track your cards drawn and create tokens once you've accumulated enough. Lighthouse Chronologist, Toxrill, and Rottenmouth Viper are also good cards to proliferate. In the deck, these will be the only source of level, slime, and blight counters. Toxrill is one of only 3 cards to make slime counters, and Rottenmouth Viper is the only source of blight counters in the game so far. Alright, let's talk about Azor's Elocutors. You will never win a game off this card, but we're including it because it's the only card that makes filibuster counters. You have to make it all the way back to your upkeep with at least 4 counters to automatically win the game. There's a world where we finesse this by somehow storing filibuster counters on other permanents and proliferating them, but this is 100% a style include. Dude, Maldhound's gonna gut me. With the deck core out of the way, let's get into some more weird tech. Since Proliferate copies each kind of counter on each permanent or player, cards that make a few different types of counters at once can up the chaos of our board state. Crystalline Giant produces a whopping 10 types of counters on its own, and Agent's Toolkit enters with 4. An honorable mention that did not make the cut is Coral Reef, which has 2 unique counters, Polyp and +0/+1. But by far, my favorite include is Emissary of Soulfire, which produces energy and exalted counters. It's also the only source of exalted counters in the game so far. Since exalted is a keyword counter, it will stack when we proliferate them. Even better if we spread them out. Sensei Goldentail's training counters, on the other hand, are not keyword counters. There's a lot to unpack for this one. 1. Training counters are a unique counter. 2. They do not give training. 3. In fact, are only reminder counters and have no rules function at all. 4. Are linked to one of the worst mechanics in Magic's history. And 5. Give us the funny image of Atraxa training to be a samurai. We're including it and I will hear no counter arguments on the matter. Moving on. Drake Hatcher is a newer card from Magic Foundations that's the only card to produce incubation counters. The reason why this card is interesting is because incubation counters have appeared in the game before on the card Triassic Egg. Originally, this card used unnamed counters, but a very briefly existing errata renamed them incubation counters, until a second errata renamed those to hatchling counters. Triassic Egg could have been the only card to ever go through two unique counters, but we would later find these on Ludovic's test subject. So it's just a bit of trivia that Drake Hatcher has a unique counter, but wasn't the first card to produce them. Palliation Accord isn't in the deck, but received its unique palliation counters in an errata once they decided to print shield counters in New Capenna. It was originally in the deck because it's never been printed with the correct text, but it's a little too unplayable even by my standards. A similar thing happened with Endless Scream. Wizards quickly realized that the X value in this card's mana cost can't actually be tracked once the spell leaves the stack, so they introduced Scream counters. Unfortunately, the card has never been printed with the correct Oracle text, even though it was on the list, and you would never know about these counters otherwise. We're hoping to use this to our advantage by confusing the board state, igniting rules disputes, and maybe getting a sneaky commander damage kill in with Atraxa. Gavel of the Righteous and Perry the Pulverizer can also get out of hand in this deck. Gavel is a cheap equipment that scales with the number of counters on it, and notably doesn't care if they're the charge counters it produced itself. There are a few ways to get additional types of counters on it so we can start proliferating twice as quickly, and once we reach 4 counters, Gavel starts giving double strike, which makes Atraxa extra lethal. Perry, on the other hand, is one of few cards that cares about how many different kinds of counters we have on board. For each kind, Perry buffs one of your creatures and gives it trample. It's the perfect include for this deck because we produce just over 50 different types of counters. Might as well dream, right? That's it for the synergies, but don't worry, there's still a few more pieces of spice. Let's move on to our interactive suite. Unfortunately, with the limitations I set for myself, there were very few good choices. To protect Atraxa, we're running Skrelv, Arwen, and Ripples of Potential. Toxic provides us with a source of poison counters, and Arwen is both the cheapest way to get an indestructible counter and a source of lifelink counters. Slippery Bogbonder is one of only 5 cards that produces hexproof counters, so it was an easy include here too. But a card you've probably never seen before is Delif's Cube. This is the only card that produces cube counters. The way it works is you have to get in with an unblocked attacker and choose for it not to assign any combat damage. In return, you get a cube counter that can be later cashed in to regenerate any creature. This card is strictly unplayable, but if you were to ever play it, it would be in a proliferate deck, so you never have to activate the first ability any more than once. For recursion, we're running Evolution Witness and Marin of Clan Neltov. These are both great cards that repeatedly get stuff back from the graveyard. Marin will also serve as a resident experience counter generator. The War in Heaven is a saga, so it uses lore counters. It draws us cards and reanimates some creatures on its final chapter, but it's also the only card to produce Necrodermis counters. And Illicit Masquerade is the only card in the game to produce imposter counters. It's here to protect us from board wipes. Neither of these counters do anything when proliferated, but they're pretty neat. For removal, we're running on heavy copium fumes. Volatile Stormdrake is an energy counter-based removal spell. Promise of Loyalty is a board wipe that is the only place we'll find Vow counters in the game. And Kaya the Inexorable is the only Planeswalker in the deck, and so she uses loyalty counters and her exclusive Ghost Form counters. But we'll probably make good use of her minus ability. Storm of Forms is a bounce spell that cares about how many kinds of counters we have on board. For each one, it'll copy itself. This has to be good, right? Listen man, I want to live the dream. The final 3 cards in the deck are Deadly Designs, Archery Training, and Serrated Arrows. Even if you know one of these cards, you've probably never heard all 3 in the same sentence. Deadly Designs is an enchantment, and the only card to use block counters. Once it gets 5 of them, it lets you destroy 2 creatures. Archery Training is a pretty bad aura, but if there was a deck to play it in, it would be with Atraxa. At the beginning of your upkeep, you may put an arrow counter on Archery Training. From there on, you can tap Enchanted Creature to deal X damage to an attacking or blocking creature. Since Atraxa has Vigilance, she can attack while holding up this ability. Her Death Touch will let it kill any creature, and the number of arrow counters can be proliferated and contribute to Atraxa's lifelink. Serrated Arrows, on the other hand, uses arrow head counters. These are different from arrow counters and are both unique and found only on these two cards. Serrated Arrows is also the only source of -1/-1 counters in this deck, so it checks the box of producing 2 counters at once. Post-editing clip, I made this video prior to the Aetherdrift spoiler season, and they just revealed this new card today. This is decent removal, and we could have had Atraxa riding a Corgi. And with that, that's the whole deck list. A pile of garbage I tried to hone into the most technically unique Atraxa deck. Overall, the gimmick makes it impossible to get a super competitive build. But I did try to curate a balance between playable and absolute tomfoolery. Our current total is 54 different counters, with just under half being counters found only on one card. How's that for unique? There are 2 cards that I really wish I could have included, Contagion and Fishing Pole, which make -2, -1, and bait counters, respectively. Contagion is just a hilariously bad removal spell, but a Fisherman's Samurai Atraxa was something I really wanted. Could this deck be better? Let me know what you came up with. If you actually want to play this deck, please check out the link to the primer. It includes the full list of counters produced, some more notable exclusions, and a note on the mana base. As always, a link to all my friends' videos will also be in a pinned comment. I make videos about Magic trivia and design. If you like content like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Thanks to my friends Rebel, 33 Elk, Morgan, Trinket Mage, and Maldhound. And a huge thanks to my one Patreon supporter. See you next time.